So far, our default values have been hard-coded within the function. There's no way for the calling program to change the defaults so that multiple calls to the function can make use of the same values. Let's say we want 3 squares that have the same colors and same dimensions, but are positioned in different locations. With our existing function, each call from the code would have to pass the repeated parameter values we want to use. This code is called just like the previous version. Notice the addition of a new property called clear. This is a new parameter that we'll make use of, and it won't break any legacy, new, or future code. That's a major benefit of using object parameters in the first place. New parameters can be added without worrying about breaking contracts with legacy code. In this case, a clear property of true tells us to clear the canvas before drawing the rectangle. The easiest way to do this is to reassign the width of the canvas. We'll assign the width to the existing width. That will cause the canvas to clear. We've also added an exposed draw options object that we use for our default values. Since it is just as accessible as the draw function, calling code can modify the default values that this function uses, and any subsequent calls to the function will reflect those values. In essence, the calling code can override our default values. Here's what the draw options object looks like. Nothing fancy, just all of our name parameters with their default values, including the new clear property. Since none of the legacy code expected the canvas to clear prior to drawing, we use a default value of false. Speaking of legacy code, before we get into using the new functionality, let's make sure our legacy code still works. All the rectangles are showing up. That means the default options object is supplying the expected values. Let's see how else we can use it. The exposed draw options object is useful in several instances. The first instance is if you want to make a use of a set of parameters for multiple function calls. In this case, we're setting the fill and stroke colors to something other than the defaults of silver and black. We're proving that standard web RGB values can be used as well as named colors. Once we set the new default colors, we make 2 new calls. The first one uses all the defaults to define the square and also passes the new clear parameter. The second draws the same square in the bottom right as we did in version 2 of our function. We expect to get our original squares in the same locations, but with different colors. We'll switch to Firefox and show this intermediate result. Notice how the original rectangles are no longer shown. The code actually drew them and immediately cleared the canvas before drawing the final 2 boxes. We could add a simple alert message before using the clear parameter to prove that. We're not going to do that now, though. Feel free to do this if you're following along. Think about what the last 2 function calls are doing. They are essentially making calls using the legacy contract. Exposing the default values in an object has allowed us to make changes to the results of legacy code without having to actually change any legacy code at all. Let's comment out the lines at the end and move the 2 option overrides up before the legacy code. We'll pretend the graphics department actually can make use of color and wants to change the color scheme of all squares and rectangles in use throughout the website. Any rectangles with specified colors should retain those colors. Any rectangles and squares that are using the old color scheme need to be updated. Instead of hunting down every place in our code that calls our function with no color values, we can override the default values and all legacy code starts working the way we want, without making risky changes to any of the legacy code. All the function calls that didn't specify a color are now making use of our new default colors. It would be very simple now to have a different color scheme each month. The website could change according to holidays, seasons, or specific marketing campaigns. Exposing default values as an object to calling code makes it easy to change the base assumptions of our function. It eases coding when the same parameters will be used repetitively. Legacy code doesn't have to change, yet we can still get different results. Once the default object has been changed, it remains changed until changed again by some mechanism. A page reload is the most likely candidate. If temporary changes are desired, the original state of the default object would have to be saved and restored after the values were no longer desired.